Welcome back, everybody, to the second session in this series of theories of consciousness. I will hand it over straight to Francesco, who is the curator and chair of this series and who presented with us yesterday. Welcome, Francesco.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the second day of this seminar series on theories of consciousness. Today, we have the great honor to have Professor Liad Mudrik. She's a researcher at the School of Psychological Science and Sagol School of Neuroscience at Tel Aviv University. Her research focuses on conscious experience, its neural mechanism and functions. Professor Mudrik completed 2 PhD dissertations at Tel Aviv University, one in cognitive psychology and one in philosophy. She continued with a postdoc fellowship at the Christoph Koch lab at the Caltech Institute. Perhaps you remember yesterday I mentioned the pivotal role of Francis Crick and Christoph Koch in welcoming consciousness in the mainstream science, so to say. And she then continued, in 2019, she was invited to join the Young Israeli Academy of Science. And she's also the leader of the Cogitate consortium, which is an international adversarial collaboration aimed at arbitrating between theories of consciousness, and a Tenebarum Fellow of the CIFAR Brain, Mind, and Consciousness Program. And probably many more things, but to not waste your time, I'll hand it over to Professor Mudrik.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I should say one of the leaders. We are 3 people who are doing this together, so I don't want to take all the, to claim all the fame to myself or take all the credit. So I'm very glad to be here and thank you for inviting me. I will share my slides and hopefully we'll be able to tell you a little bit about theories of consciousness and how they are tested. I will say, as far as I'm concerned, I'm happy to take questions. And so what I thought that might be a good way to do it was, for the talk is going to be divided into 4 sections. And at the end of each section, I will stop and ask for questions. So you don't have to wait until the entire talk is over. And after about an hour, I suggest we take a few minutes break and then resume the discussion. So you won't be too tired of what I have to say. I mentioned that there are 4 parts to this talk. The first will be just a short overview of theories of consciousness. The second would ask how these theories are tested. The third will ask if they can be arbitrated. And the fourth will ask why it is even important to ask these questions and to think about these topics. So let's start with theories of consciousness. And in our field, it's actually a pretty interesting thing. I guess in the talk you've already heard from Francesco, he spoke about the neural correlates of consciousness. If Crick and Koch were mentioned, I imagine that this was a part of the thing, of the topics that were discussed. And indeed, for several decades, the field has been focused on searching the neural correlates of consciousness. But what is very interesting to see is that in the last few years, the field is also gradually shifting to speaking and discussing more and more theories of consciousness and not only the neural correlates of consciousness due to several reasons. One of them is that indeed our field really abounds with theories of consciousness. So we have in one of the recent review papers by Anil Seth and Tim Bain, they counted, if I remember correctly, 26 different theories of consciousness. And there are many papers that try to compare these theories and classify them, categorize them according to different aspects. And indeed, in that paper by Seth and Bain that I mentioned, they focus on 4 main theories. And it's not incidental that these are the 4 theories that they are focused on. These are, although other theories might be correct, so definitely these are not the leading theories with respect to being the closest to the truth. But these 4 theories for sure are the ones who have been discussed most in different publications and in different conferences. And in that respect are considered today the main theories of consciousness. But again, I just want to emphasize, because I'm also going to focus on these four in this talk, that doesn't mean that other theories of consciousness are not true or are not relevant, or there are several theories that have been gaining more and more interest in the last few years. So definitely there is more to come. By the way, I see that one of the participants is drawing yellow dots and marks on the screen. I think maybe the name was Valentina or something like that. So maybe worthwhile deleting those. Okay, so let's start going over these four theories one by one and trying to understand them better. Now, I want to say very clearly, I cannot do justice to any one of these theories in the few minutes I have to spend on each one of them. So each one deserves its own seminar and a deep dive into the principles and the ideas that govern them. But still, I'm hoping that even this short overview would give you a hint about what these theories are all about and what's the differences between them. I understand that many of you, I imagine that many of you are familiar with them, but I understand that there are also people here that are not familiar. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's just go over them and understand the main ideas. So the first theory I would like to present here is the global neuronal workspace theory. It was first suggested as a psychological or cognitive model by Bernard Bars, but then adopted into neuroscience. I should say, all theories that I'm going to discuss today are neuroscientific theories in the sense that they all aspire to explain the relations between neural activity and conscious experiences. And what's the difference between the neural mechanisms underlying conscious processes as opposed to unconscious processes. So I'm focusing here already on the neuroscientific versions of these theories. So the scientists that introduced the neuroscientific version of the global workspace theory are Stanislas Dehaene and Lionel Nakache. It was in the seminal paper from 2001. Recently, Claire Sergeant, who's been a student of Stanislas Dehaene and now has her own lab conducting beautiful research on consciousness, she actually has her own variant of the global workspace theory. So it's also interesting to see how these theories evolve and develop. And the main idea, as you can see here in the brain that is presented on the right, is that for and it can also maybe present it here. So for the global neuronal workspace theory, unconscious processes are encapsulated and limited to specialized processing modules. So for example, if you are able to process a face unconsciously, this is thanks to activity in the fusiform face area, a specialized module that already has the expertise, if you want, for processing faces. And to the same degree, you have you can have activity in LOC for objects, or the word from area for words, and so on and so forth. So we are able to process information also unconsciously, sometimes to even surprisingly high level. But the key thing is that for the global neuronal workspace theory, these unconscious processes are always limited to these encapsulated specialized modules. And unless the information crosses a threshold and is being amplified by attention, it would not enter the global neuronal workspace, meaning that A, it will not be consciously perceived, and B, there will be no interactions between processing modules that would allow also integration. So you can see on the right, conscious processes are characterized by wide activation mediated by this global neuronal workspace that has specialized neurons with long-range axons originating from frontal and parietal areas, extending into many other areas in the brain. And once this information is being broadcast throughout the brain, we are conscious of it. So the theory makes several clear predictions. One is that we should find in frontoparietal areas a global network of specialized neurons with long-range projections that are able to broadcast that information. A second prediction by this theory is that access to information, conscious access, depends on attentional amplification that allows this dynamic mobilization of information into the global workspace. And because this involves crossing a threshold, and this amplification processes in the brain, it should be characterized by this phasic ignition of signals. So we should see a nonlinear, clear response in frontoparietal areas that starts about 250 milliseconds after the stimulus has been presented and marks this update of the workspace that involves the broadcasting of the information throughout the brain. So this is the global neuronal workspace for you in a few minutes. Let's move on to the second theory. So this is the integrated information theory. It was first suggested in a paper by Giulio Tononi and Gerard Edelman, but since then has been thoroughly developed and also, I would say it's not developed both conceptually and mathematically and empirically by Giulio Tononi himself, together with Melanie Boly. And in recent years, also Christoph Koch, who was mentioned before, has joined the supporters of this theory. Now, integrated information theory is I would say that on the one hand, it's one of the theories that gain the most, maybe, I don't, you know, I'm not sure if it's true, but I would say that its supporters think that it's not only that it is the best theory, but sometimes they would say that it is the only theory, because it's a theory that is highly comprehensive, that aims at even solving the hard problem by David Chalmers. So it's also very, very ambitious. And so for them, it provides a complete story that the other theories are lacking. But on the other hand, the people who criticize this theory, and you might have heard some criticism in the last couple of months, because there has been a big story around that, the people who criticize it actually think that it is not scientific. So it has attracted a lot of criticism on the one hand, a lot of interest on the other hand. Let me try to explain it to you. I still see the yellow drawings on the screen. I don't know if you can you see them too, by the way, or is it only on my, yeah, so it's from
Yes.
Valien or something like that, Valjean. Valjean.
You're doing something on your iPad.
Yeah. So although the drawings are interesting, I am afraid that they might get in the way of some of the people's view here. Yeah, so Valjean, if you can remove them, it would be nice. If not, then we'll try to ignore them. It will also be an exercise in selective attention. Okay, so going back to IIT. So the idea behind IIT is that as opposed to GNW and other theories, they don't start with the data. Instead, they start with the phenomenology itself. So they ask, what are the critical conditions, the necessary and sufficient conditions for each conscious experience, whatever that conscious experience might be. And they come up with a list of 5 axioms, the way they call them, that are supposed to be this type of sufficient and necessary conditions and characterize each experience. So let's just go over them relatively quickly. So the first is an intrinsic existence, meaning that every conscious experience exists. It exists for me. So this is a critical thing. It exists for the experiencer from the first person perspective. So not only something that you can observe from the third person perspective, it exists from the system. But what does that mean? It should have the causal power to change the system, to make a difference for the system. So that's the first axiom. The second axiom, as you can see here on the, on the screen, I just wanna make sure, wait, I'm gonna stop the sharing because I was hoping that maybe this could, no, I thought that maybe that somehow might take away the scribbles, but no. Okay, so the second axiom is composition, and the idea there is that all our experiences are composed of distinctions. So when you, for example, look when you're playing the piano and you look at the visual field, you will see specific distinctions within your experience. So you can see that there is a blue book on the piano, you can see your hands, you can differentiate between the right side and the left side. So even in a very, very impoverished experience, you will still be able to make some distinctions. It will still be composite of something. For example, of having a right side and the left side, an upper side and a lower side, and so on and so forth. So every experience is composed of distinctions. The third axiom is information. And the idea there is that every experience is informative, not only in virtue of the information it itself conveys, for example, here looking at the piano, but also in virtue of all the information it excludes. So when you now experience me talking to you, you don't only know that you're in a talk and that I'm the one who's talking to you and so on and so forth. You also know that you're not in class, you're not in the beach, you're not in bed. And in that respect, the greater or the bigger the repertoire of possible experiences you could have, the more informative each experience is, because it excludes more alternatives. So in that respect, every conscious experience is informative. The fourth axiom is integration. And here the idea is that although experiences are composed of distinctions, they're integrated, they're one. So even if I really want to, I cannot experience the shape of a dog separately from its color. I cannot experience the right side of the world from the left side separately. So experiences are always integrated. We only have one experience at a time. Again, it can be composed of different distinctions that we can make, but it is still integrated. And lastly, the axiom of exclusion says that every experience is exactly what it is, meaning that it has clear borders. You cannot see or experience less than you're experiencing. So for example, you cannot take away the color, even if you really, really want to, but you also cannot experience more than you're experiencing. So you cannot, for example, experience the width of your arteries because it's simply not a part of your conscious experience. So experiences are what they are, nothing more and nothing less. Now, if you want to argue with IIT, the first step could be, for example, criticize the axioms, as people have indeed done. But what IIT then does is say, if you accept these axioms, then our next step is to derive postulates from these axioms, which are basically a list of characterizations of how the system should be built in order to implement these axioms, in order for these axioms to be possible even. And so with these postulates that are now being also translated into mathematical equations and calculations, whereby you calculate the amount of integrated information a system has. And that for IIT is a quantification of the level of consciousness it has. And that's also why this theory is so ambitious, because it also aspires to tell us, given a specific system, if I know the way the system is built and if I know its state, I can then calculate this amount of integrated information that is signified by phi, and then know how conscious the system is. With respect to the human brain, the theory also has specific predictions. So one prediction is that there should be a global major complex, meaning there should be a clear, because we said the fifth axiom is that conscious experiences are clear, they have clear borders. So in the same line of reasoning, the neural substrate of consciousness should have clear borders. It should be very clear what's in and what's out. And based on anatomical considerations, the theory predicts that posterior areas that are connected in a grid-like manner would be the neural substrate of consciousness, as opposed to frontal ones, for example. So here you could already see a point of divergence between IIT and GNW. Another important feature of this theory is that it kind of goes against what we typically think about the way the brain works, in the sense that there is no signal that is being shared or broadcasted or being transmitted from one area to another, with one area kind of deciphering the meaning of that signal. So it's not as if the information from V1 gets at some point to FFA says this is a face, and then transmits the information about the face to the global workspace like a signal that is being transferred. Instead, the system, just the major complex, is in a specific state, and that state feels like something. If you unfold the cause-effect structure, I know that I'm saying words that you don't understand at this point, because we don't have the time to go into that, but for IIT, the important thing for each state is what are the previous causes of that state and what would be the future effects of that state. And if you then unfold these possible causes and possible effects, you get the cause-effect structure, which for IIT is identical with the experience. So the specific state has an unfolded cause-effect structure that for IIT is actually equivalent or identical to the experience itself. And it feels like something to be in that specific state. And that's also why they predict sustained content-specific activity of the major complex throughout the percept. And this is another point of disagreement with GNW, because for GNW, the system works, the global workspace works by updates. So the information gets in, you have the ignition, now we see a face. When the face is gone, we will have another ignition, signaling the end of the perception of the face, the conscious perception of the face, and a new percept will begin. So you see here another difference between the two. Moving on to higher order thought. So higher order thought, that's actually an interesting story, because this started as a purely philosophical theory by David Rosenthal, where he explained that for us to be consciously aware of some piece of information, it's not enough to have the representation of that information or a state that represents that information in the brain. We must have a higher order state that kind of points at this first order state and says, this is what I am conscious of now. So imagine that you have different representations now in different areas in your brain, because you're in a rich environment and you have different impressions on the processing mechanism that you have. One of them will be selected for conscious experience, or one of them is the thing that you are conscious of now. And what makes it conscious is that we have a higher order state that points at it or re-represents it. And I should say, this was then translated into neuroscience by Hak-Wan Lau. So in this important paper of theirs in 2011, I believe, they introduced this idea of higher order theories in the brain, where the higher order state is subserved by activation in prefrontal areas, specifically dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Since then, there are also other versions of higher order thought by Axel Clearmans and Joseph Ledoux and others, Richard Brown and others, and Stephen Fleming. And there are many variants of higher order thought theories, all of them very interesting. And one of the key things that they claim, as I said, is that the first order representation is not enough. You must have a second order, higher order representation that would index that this information is being consciously processed. And so the claims by higher order thought is that you should have this indexing mechanism, or again, it could be a re-representation mechanism. It again depends on the version of higher order thought. And another interesting claim that they make is that consciousness should not have any specific function. So to contrast it with GNW that I presented at the beginning, for that theory, for GNW, there are things you cannot do with unconscious processes, without conscious perception. For example, you cannot integrate over different modalities or different types of information. You cannot do what they call mental chaining of operations. So take a piece of information, perform some mental operation on it, perform another mental operation, and so on and so forth over time. You should not be able to show flexible behavior. Everything is kind of more automated for unconscious processing. For higher order thought, this is not true because the function is not subserved by the higher order state. It's actually mediated by the first order state, and the higher order state is just it's kind of responsible for you being conscious of it, but not for your performance necessarily. And that's also why very beautiful line of work that they have been doing is to try and come up with paradigms where performance is actually equal between conscious and unconscious processing, and the only thing that differs is your experience of that information. Last theory, before we take a pause and breathe for a second, is the first order theory. So this is recurrent processing. In the paper by Bain and Seth, they combine it with predictive processing. So in the brain here, you see this idea of upcoming information and downstream predictions that are being compared all the time with the upcoming information. And indeed, you can think of these first order theories or recurrent processing theory as one variant of predictive processing. Predictive processing is a theory that goes way beyond consciousness, but it has been adopted by some, including Anil Seth that I've mentioned before, to be considered a theory that could be a theory for consciousness, that could help us understand consciousness better. But if we focus now on recurrent processing, it was suggested by Victor Lame, and also in many ways inspired by Ned Block's differentiation between phenomenal consciousness, which is how the experience feels like, and access consciousness, which is our ability to report and perform cognitive functions on this experience. And the idea there is simple. So as opposed to higher order thought theories, here the claim is that you would not need any higher order state in order to become conscious. The only thing you need is first order activations within the sensory areas, as long as they involve feedback connections. So according to the theory, unconscious information will be processed in a feed-forward manner, so only kind of bottom-up kind of processing. But it's only when we have recurrent processing within local sensory areas that the information will become conscious. And here, the main claim, besides this idea of consciousness being localized into sensory areas, and I should say, by the way, this theory has been developed mainly for visual awareness. It could, in principle, be applied to other modalities. So you could have first order activations in the auditory cortex, for example, but the vast amount of research on this theory has been visual. Here, as opposed to higher order thought, similarly to GNW, there is a claim also for a function of consciousness, which is mainly perceptual organization. So the claim is that you will not be able to form perceptual organization without conscious experience. So now you have like a very quick and dirty presentation of these four theories that we have focused on. And the next thing I would like to do is to ask how these theories have been tested empirically. But before I do that, I just wanted to see if there are any questions about the four theories, or if they are well understood. So I could then go on. So any questions, things you would like to know about these theories?
I see Pam has her hand up. Pam,
Yeah.
would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you, Liad. This is absolutely fascinating to me. I want to ask you a question about the higher order things. And long ago, I read a system called The Fourth Way by Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And in it, man is likened to a three-story house, lower orders, but also there are two higher orders, emotional, intellectual. We don't hear them because the three lower orders are in a mess. And the only way to eventually access those higher orders is to clear the mess. So that means you have to begin to understand really what you are as a human being, which they liken to a machine and not conscious, not fully conscious. So I wanted simply to ask you, is there a correlation between what you're saying and what my understanding is?
I think it's definitely, I can see the similarity, but I think that the higher order thought that the theories that I'm talking about are way more basic, because we are not talking about emotions. It can be applied. So Ledoux's theory is all about being conscious of emotions, or at least it's based on that. But the thing that we are all trying to explain, and maybe I should have said that, not maybe, surely I should have said that at the beginning, is perceptual consciousness. So the way we perceive the world, its phenomenal qualitative aspects, and our ability to have access to that information. So I think in a way, it's a more basic question than the relations that you are pointing at, I think. But you can find the parallel. So here too, you need this higher order state.
In order to connect with a particular type of consciousness, which is what I understand it to be, not a heightened awareness or anything like that. It's something else.
Exactly.
And could I also briefly just ask you, is that other kind of consciousness that's so tricky to pin down, and what you're all discussing all the time, and I'm so interested in it, could it be likened to something more fluid, not a thing, it's a field maybe, and therefore at that higher end of our perceptual intelligence, it's possible to tap into that, not knowingly, but a perception will happen very quickly, and that's it. That is the consciousness which we are connected with through those.
Yeah. It's a great question also because, so my former supervisor for my PhD, I was supervised both by Leon Dewell and Dominique Lamy. And Leon has this suggestion where, according to which consciousness is not really a thing, but you can think about like a multi-dimensional space whereby you have different factors that affect consciousness. And consciousness is something, as you say, that is way more fluid, that depends on different boundary conditions, and these conditions could change from one situation to another. And I think that very much resembles what you were suggesting here. So I think you might be interested in
thank you so much. I think I'm on a better track now. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Pam, for coming in. Francesco.
Yes. Thank you very much. I would like to reconnect to something you said during the presentation about the fact, for example, when you mentioned IIT, that supporters of IIT thinks this is the only consciousness theory. I'm one of these annoying people, perhaps, and so the thing I was thinking is, like, if we look at the history of science, we see that in the 19th century, like, the word theory was usually associated to like very big theory, like a much bigger scope, and usually connected through laws of nature and, like, so to say, very high goals, right? But then if we look more what happened after that, especially in the 20th century, it seems like the word has been a little bit inflated to include a lot of much restricted in scope, you know, like not less valuable by any means, but just with a less scope. And in fact, even as a philosopher of science, if you ask me what is a scientific theory, I would really struggle to give you a very easy definition of that. So I would like to know if you have any thoughts on that.
So one thing that we've been talking about a lot in the last few years is what constitutes as a theory of consciousness, and what would we require from a theory of consciousness. I think one thing that is clear to me is that The theory should, of course, give us predictions that can be tested and can be falsified. The theory should be very clear about what aspects of consciousness it's supposed to explain and give some definition of consciousness. And one thing that might become clear is that these theories might not define consciousness in the same way. And so I think, to me, it seems as if all our theories, including IIT, are still in the process of development. So it's clear to me that we are very far from, I will speak about the way we try to test the theories. We are not at the stage like in physics where we can just derive clear predictions from the theories ourselves without even consulting with the theory leaders and test them in a clear-cut experiment. So I think that's also an interesting phase for us as a field, because that allows us to show the theories the places where they fall short and where they need to be more specific, and they need to maybe give us a different mechanism. So I think it's a very interesting, if you're interested in history of science, I think it's an interesting period that we.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I was talking recently with a student of yours, Nicolò Negro, and I support his view that maybe rather than theories, a research program is a much better expression for the scientific environment we are in nowadays. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, would you like to continue?
Yeah, I see that there. So someone sent me a message that is actually private on the chat, asking if all theories use the word consciousness or qualia to refer to the same thing, or if it has different definitions. Excellent question, Mahmoud. Thank you very much. I will relate to that a bit later on in the next part of the talk. Relating to IIT, why its supporters see it as the only theory. What does it have that the other theories do not have? I think that what it has is kind of conceptual. It has a metaphysical framework and a mathematical formulation that the others might not have. It's very comprehensive in the sense that it claims to be able to explain a lot. And on the other hand, as I said, those who criticize it are either not happy with its metaphysics, not happy with the axioms or with the postulates or with the way. I think some of the critics think that its aspirations are too high and it doesn't give you the required tools in order to fulfill these aspirations. And if all theories are mathematically constructed, not at all. So for IIT, it relies very strongly on mathematics. Again, some people criticize that mathematics. For GNW, there have been several very interesting computational models, but the claims themselves are not formalized as mathematical sentences. For higher order thought, also, there have been some computational models. I fail to remember ones for recurrent processing, but it doesn't mean that there aren't any. Okay, I see two questions. I will answer those and then continue, and then the otherwise, and I'll answer at the end. So Chris asks if all four theories involved corticostriatal loops, and if so, should the function of the basal ganglia also be considered? Actually, not to my knowledge. So these theories are mostly cortical and not subcortical. All of them involve some kind of loop. So some kind of feedback connections is required by all four theories, the way I understand them at least, but not necessarily with the basal ganglia. And Oliver is asking, all of these theories rely on some version of the idea that a notion of information can be identified with conscious experiences. What implication that this overall paradigm has for our understanding of what information is? Excellent question. Well, it depends, because for IIT, also the notion of integration is somewhat different than, let's say, Shannon integration. So I'm sure that there will be also some crosstalk between these theories and the understanding of information. I don't think we are there yet. And definitely I cannot give you some interesting insights, but maybe people have, and I'm just not aware of them. Okay, with your permission, I want to continue to the next section of this talk, and I'll be happy to answer other questions later on as well. So the second question that I want to raise here is how these theories are tested. And this is work that has been done by Itai Yaron, a PhD student in my lab, a brilliant one, I should say. All the work that I'm going to present now is basically his, together with Michael Pitts and Lucia Meloni, two excellent researchers that I've been privileged to work with, and I'll get back to them also later on when I'll speak about the Cogitate consortium. So the four of us basically realized that we have these theories, and specifically the four theories that I presented here, but it applies to other theories as well. And each theory seems to support itself. So if you read a review paper by the proponents of each one of these theories, it's as if you're reading about a different phenomena, although both of them or all of them speak about consciousness. But one tells you about studies finding support in frontal areas. The other tells you about findings that support claims about posterior areas. So that is already a bit confusing. Like, how can that be the case? Another observation is that the field is highly fractionated. Again, if you have been following the scientific news about what's been going on in our field in the last couple of months, you have different theories. You have people who are either strongly for the theories or strongly against the theories, and they allow some heated discussions to take place. And also, you find hardly any crosstalk between these theories. So you don't find people from IIT testing GNW and people from GNW testing higher order thought, and from higher order thought testing recurrent processing. Each theory seems to be evolving on its own without much dialogue. And another observation is that the methods in the field are highly heterogeneous. So that's interesting. We kind of wanted to see whether that last observation could perhaps explain why we have so many theories and why each theory has been able to provide empirical support for its claims, although they are quite different from one another. So what Itai basically did, in a Herculean effort, I must say, was to collect all papers, all neuroscientific papers that interpreted their findings in light of these four theories of consciousness. And we started with 7,000 papers. He narrowed it down to 884 papers that he actually read, screened out, and was left with 365 papers. And all these papers, they reported 412 experiments whose results have been interpreted in light of these theories. And the first thing we wanted to ask was, how do these experiments divide between the theories? And you can see here the number of experiments that presented their results either as supporting or challenging each one of the four theories. And two things immediately pop out when you look at this figure. The first thing is that the theories have not been equally tested. So GNW was much widely studied compared to, let's say, higher order thought. For higher order thought, you find a lot of theoretical papers, but less empirical ones. Another interesting thing is that for almost all theories, you find way more supporting evidence than challenging evidence. And this possible confirmation bias is not something that is unique to the field of consciousness, but it's definitely something that we should think about. So if you adopt the kind of Popperian line of thought according to which science progresses through challenging theories as opposed to confirming theories, then we might have a problem here if we tend to always confirm theories as opposed to challenge them. One thing that we asked was, maybe this pattern reflects the fact that our field is relatively young. So maybe at the early stages, we are less kind of occupied with challenging theories. We first want to establish them and only then start to challenge them. So if that's the pattern, then we would expect to see more challenging evidence with time. Another thing we wanted to test was whether there is crosstalk between the theories. And we kind of prepared this toy model whereby the success of one theory would lead to the decline of another. So this is again, it's only an illustration of a cumulative graph whereby the x-axis is the years, the y-axis is the number of papers or experiments that supported the theory. And if you see that the blue theory thrives, and then the orange one, we just don't see more and more papers that support it anymore, because the success of one theory influences the success of another. So we wanted to see whether if we look at the trends over time, will we see something like that? And the answer is no. Basically, as you can see here to the left is a cumulative graph of papers that just mention the theories, support the theories, or challenge them. And you see that all the theories just gain more and more support with time. We don't see any trend towards having more challenging experiments. We also don't see a trend towards the success of one theory influencing the success of another. So we think that this shows that we have limited crosstalk between the theories, and this might be something we would like to change. Another thing that Itai asked was, okay, how many of these experiments were actually designed a priori in order to test predictions of these theories? And when they looked at that division, he saw that only 1/3 of the experiments that supported the theories were theory-driven. When we say theory-driven, we mean that in the introduction, the authors presented at least one prediction of at least one theory that their experiment tests. Now, we know that some researchers, not anyone who's in this room, and I hope not anyone ever, write their introduction after they already see the results. But we ignore that. So we say we take the author's word for granted. If they say that their experiment was designed in order to test a prediction, we accept it as is. And even under this liberal interpretation, we see that only 1/3 of the papers show that pattern, while the others tend to just either mention the theories or interpreted their findings post hoc. So imagine that you found frontal activations, you would say, this is in line with the global neuronal workspace. We all do that, but we think that we might need more theory-driven experiments. Why? Because when you look at experiments that ended up challenging the theories, you see that many more of them were theory-driven. So if we think, it's not that if you have a theory-driven experiment, you will more likely challenge the theory, but it is true that if you challenge the theory, you most likely started with an experiment that, to begin with, wanted to test a prediction of the theory. And we think that that shows that also doesn't change over time. And we think that that shows that we need more experiments like that. And I would also say that, if I remember correctly, only 7% of the experiments were testing the predictions of more than one theory. So try to contrast theories. So that almost never happened across our database. So now we said, if we already have this big database, let's look at the results that we get. So that's kind of like a side question, but as you'll see, I think it's also revealing with respect to the sociology of the field. So what we are going to do now is simply overlay each paper, or I'll say differently, it's like vote counting. So we basically count how many papers or experiments reported each one of the areas as a neural correlate of consciousness. I want to emphasize that this is not a statistical testing. So the results that you're about to see don't mean that we actually took the data and analyzed it ourselves. We again took the kind of words, the interpretation of the authors at face value. So if they said that they found activity in FFA, differentiating between conscious and unconscious information, FFA got 1 vote, and the more papers that reported the same thing, you will see more votes. So now we can ask, which areas are the candidates for being the neural correlates of consciousness? And when we superimpose all findings, you see that almost the entire brain lights up as a neural correlate of consciousness, aside from the cerebellum, which is a good thing, but still, that's not what any of the theories predict. So none of them predict this heterogeneity of areas. But the more striking thing is that when you separate the papers based on the theory they ended up supporting, you get 4 different pictures of the neural correlates of consciousness. So papers that ended up supporting GNW find neural activity in line with the theory's predictions. Papers that supported recurrent processing in green here found activity in visual areas in line with the theory. So that I think is somewhat alarming. And the same pattern is found also when we look at temporal activation. So this is a plot of all the papers or the experiments that reported results on the temporal domain. So this is EEG, MEG, IEEG, and each one of them is colored based on the label that was given by the authors. And I was expecting, in line with what I've learned about consciousness, to find like 2 different clusters, early activations, late activations. You don't really see that. And if I wouldn't have colored this thing for you, see, there is one paper that reported P3 starting already at the 150 milliseconds. So there is great variability also in the interpretation of these findings. And if we again separate it to papers that supported GNW versus recurrent processing, you see, again, 2 different pictures. So experiments that supported GNW find later effects than experiments that supported recurrent processing, again, in line with the theories. So we think that this is something that we should, to the very least, be aware of. But Itai didn't stop there. He's like, as I said, he's not only a genius, but also highly motivated to get to the bottom of things. So Itai said, let's see what happens if we just try to understand if these patterns are related to, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to stop my video, but I did. Let's see if I can undo that. Okay, I think I have to stop this. Okay, so sorry, here I am again. So he looked at the different methods that have been used in the field and asked, what if I now feed an algorithm, specifically a random forest classifier, with all the methodological choices made by the researchers, without giving the classifier any information about the results? So the classifier knows nothing about the finding. The only thing it knows is what was the paradigm, what was the sample, did they use healthy participants or patients? Did the participants report or not? What measures were used? What technique was used? So all the methodological choices the researchers have made, can we predict, based on those factors only, which theory is about to be supported? And the sad answer is that we can. And I should say, before showing you the results, that the baseline for this algorithm was already pretty high, because if you remember, the theories did not, as I said before, the experiments did not divide equally between the theories. So if the classifier would say GNW, it would be correct in most of the times, just because it was the most studied one. So we wanted to ask, can we predict beyond this baseline? And as I said, we can, or at least Itai can, to an 80% accuracy, which theory is about to be supported, solely based on the methodological factors and choices made by the researchers. So just to show you which factors were important, for example, did the participants report on their experiences or not? You can see that IIT was mostly studied using no report studies, while the other theories used more report studies. For GNW, you see a more balanced division. Similarly, for state versus content consciousness, so studying state consciousness is looking into different states. So for example, sleep versus being awake, disorders of consciousness, where the state itself changes, as opposed to studies of content of consciousness, where I present a specific stimulus and I want to see the difference between instances where you consciously perceive the stimulus and instances where you don't. And you see here again that the theories have been differently studied in that respect. Another important factor was what the measures that were used in order to measure consciousness, and the analysis measures that were used to assess the effect itself. So that kind of hints towards the conclusion that the theories might not have been tested in the same way, and maybe they have not been testing the same phenomena. Maybe their definition of consciousness, their operational definition of consciousness is actually different. So what are the lessons we take from this work to the field? First is that we think that we need more collaboration and less fractionation. And I invite all of you, if you're interested in consciousness, engage in dialogues. Don't just say what you think, but hear what the other side thinks, because that's the way to make progress, at least in my opinion. I think we need more theory-driven work. So don't only interpret your findings in retrospect, but design experiments that are initially planned in order to test theories of consciousness. I think it's an important task to understand exactly what the theories explain. So they all say that they explain consciousness in its entirety in a way, but they might not have been doing it, at least to the same degree of success. So it's our role to also try to test them in areas where they are less familiar of being tested or less used to being tested. Before I continue, I think we will take a break, but before we take that break, I wanted to show you another thing that IIT has done, which I hope could be useful for many of you if you're interested in this field. And this is the contrast database. So basically what we did was to upload all the experiments that IIT analyzed, and we already added 60 more experiments because we are updating this database as we go on. And basically you can go into this website. I'm happy to put its address in the chat. So here it is. You can go into this website and you can conduct your own queries. So you can, for example, say, give me, analyze the studies, divide them based on their reporting, give me, and see how many reported and how many didn't, used report and how many didn't. You can use this, these small buttons in order to download a CSV file that would give you all the information about these papers and the queries that you're conducting. You can compare between theories. I don't know why it doesn't want to. Let's see. You can compare between theories or not. I don't know. For some reason it got stuck. So let me just show you if maybe the world map at least, because it's fun. So you can even go into the world map and see which theory has been supported most by each country. So you are now so this is, for example, France. As you might expect, global neuronal workspace got the most support there, but you can go to different countries and see what you get there. You can also upload a new paper. So if you have a paper that relates to one of these theories, then you can upload it and classify it, and it would go through. We have this steering committee with well-established researchers in the field who would go through your classification and kind of make sure that it can go into the website. And we really hope that this would become a major resource for our community, where we could all share information, like in the spirit of dialogue, share information and conduct queries and use this as a way to get more informed about the status of the field. So that's the second part for you. I would be happy to answer some questions if you have any, and then we can take a break.
Would anyone like to come in with a question? You can also use the raise your hand function. Oh, I see Niels has a question. Please come in, Niels.
There we are. Thank you. It's very interesting, but I seem to sit here and think there's something we not really have grasped. What is consciousness? What is it we are seeking? What is it supposed to do? What is it? How does it impact our lives as we move around and meet people and blah blah blah?
Yeah.
So, so there's some kind of a global intelligence involved in that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have to think about that. And I think that, you know, we have
So oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, no, carry on.
It really depends on the theory. So
Yes, I'm aware of that. So, but for me, it looks like none of those theories actually grasp what the problem is. That's my personal deep sense. Yeah.
It could be. I think that, I always go back to this quote. There is a quote by Stuart Sutherland in the International Dictionary of Psychology in 1989, where he basically says, I'm, off the top of my head, I might be misquoting, but something like, consciousness is a fascinating but elusive phenomenon. It is hard to define or explain what it is. Nothing worth reading has been written on it, he says. And I think that indeed consciousness is elusive in the sense that on the one hand, we all have consciousness, we all understand what it is. On the other hand, even after years of trying, we failed to come up with an agreed upon definition. But I do think that there is progress in that respect. So all of us agree that consciousness involves a phenomenal aspect to it. So it feels like something.
Yes.
All of us agree that there is some access component to it as well. Some theories think that access always comes with phenomenology. Some theories think that we can tease them apart. But these two features seem to be critical for almost any definition of consciousness. I don't know if that is enough for you, but I think it's a start.
I would like to go deeper, but that's. Have you heard of David R. Watkins?
No, I haven't.
He was a spiritual leader. He was a doctor, a medical doctor, and a psychotherapist.
Okay.
And he's come up with some ideas which I like very much, and that is to do with, because this is the spiritual, and the spiritual is like a universal mind, if you like.
I'll definitely take a look. I can tell you that this is not what we are studying at this point.
No, I understand. You purely go by the brain.
Not only the brain, but the experience itself. But the assumption is this is my experience. It's not shared by any universal entity. No. It doesn't mean that there isn't such an entity, but that's not what we are studying.
Yeah, I see that.
Thank you, Niels. Thank you. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Would you like to come in?
Hi, Eleanor. Thank you. Liad, this is really clear for something so complex. My question, and I kind of wanted Francesco to go first, but my question is related to what the Pari Institute has been discussing in terms of wholeness and an implicate order. So I'm trained as an architect, and I'm fascinated by patterns and patterning as a primordial shape related to forces and energies. And so when you mentioned patterning, I was very curious about if any of the research could look at the whole brain. So I'm so sorry I missed the earlier part of the 15 minutes, but is there an aspect, I love what you're saying about taking the fragmentation and looking at the gestalt of it as a meta study of that's what I'm assuming that you're doing, right? Looking at the 800 to 400 to however many, but even within those 400 papers, is there a meta patterning of a kind of gestalt? So one of the examples I have is I live in near Fairfield, Iowa, where there's a physicist who is looking at TM as meditative states of the whole brain, and how that metaconsciousness or metacognitive processes then begin to sort of have a patterning, so to speak. And they apply it to things like music and all sorts of disciplines. And so then there's a coherence or a gestalt or a meta singularity that you can almost reverse engineer or reverse architect to a primordial pattern or sound. And that's been my research since 1991. So I'm very curious if there is even in Seth and Neil's work where you have this on-off 1-0 AB, like, is there a field condition that sort of studies that oscillating front to back? And also, how can these, so that Penrose's foundation director said that instrumentation will be the future of any of these studies of consciousness. So do we even have instrumentation that can measure E equals mc squared exponential light? And what if consciousness is even faster than that, so to speak? Like in the ancient Tao, there's, speaking to Niels's, metaphysics and spiritual, there is a consciousness that are in states and stages. And I know this is a lot, but I'm going to finish with the brain liquefies after the heart on the EEG. So is there a brain liquefaction patterning where the brain goes from a liquid to a electrical signaling? So it's going from a liquid state to a electrical state, or, and the states of energy are changing. So how can you map and measure dynamic processes of matter that are changing states of matter throughout an entire, there's a question in there, but
Yeah, I think I get it.
that's a miracle. Thank you. And how do you measure miracles in the right?
I'm not sure. I am not familiar with a work that does what you seem to have in mind, if I understood you correctly. We are able to track electrical changes in the brain, of course, with EEG or MEG or IEEG. We are able to track oxygen consumption in the brain. There are theories, like you mentioned Penrose, together with Hameroff. There is a theory about quantum description of consciousness, focusing on the microtubules. So there are theories who try to go deeper in the sense of maybe to a higher resolution. But I don't think that we are able to measure the miracles that you are describing at this point. But thank you. This is interesting, and I would definitely look into it.
Thank you. Would you like to take another question, or did you want to take your break? You're
Let's
okay?
yeah.
Okay. I'll let David please come in.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Liad, for a very fascinating talk. I had two questions. One is that do all of these theories that you've described require or imply the existence of neural representations?
No.
That's the first question. And I'm glad to hear that, because I'm not at all sure they exist. The second question is, what do you think accounts for the fact that only some neurons, for example, cortical neurons, seem to be involved in consciousness, whereas others, such as cerebellar neurons, which are certainly electrophysiologically equally complex, are not so involved?
Right. So I will refer to IIT to answer both of your questions. So IIT is the theory that doesn't rely on representations. Okay. And it also gives you one explanation, but I think this actually, I dare say that this explanation is relevant to the other theories as well. So to my understanding, the wiring of neurons in the cerebellum is mostly feed forward, as opposed to feedback connections that you have in cortical areas. And so they would claim that the reason the cerebellum is not related to consciousness is not the neurons themselves, but the way they are wired, the way they are connected. And if you don't have feedback connections, then the system cannot affect itself. It doesn't have causal powers. So this would not be the substrate of consciousness in the brain. For other theories, like the global neuronal workspace, again, the reason the frontoparietal neurons are needed is because these are the neurons that have long-range projections to other brain areas. So that would be the specification that tells you why these neurons are related to consciousness while others do not. What I suggest is that at this point, so this is now, it's 8:10 on my time zone, I guess a different hour for you all. I suggest we take a 5-minute break. Is that enough for everyone? And
yep, that works fine for us. Yep.
1:15.
Okay.
So we'll
see everybody at 1:15. Perfect. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming back. I appreciate it. And I'll continue now to the third part of this talk, which focuses on our attempt to arbitrate between the theories. So, and maybe let me just put the chat here so I could see it. Let's see if I can do it. Yeah, okay, good. So in our attempt to arbitrate between theories, we focused on the global neuronal workspace and integrated information theory. And for me, it all started. It's I should say it's the entire idea here is that adversarial collaborations might be a possible solution to the type of problems that I've showed you, demonstrated to you before in Itai's work. And adversarial collaborations have been pursued where basically you have theory leaders with opposing view working together in order to devise an experiment that would test their predictions. And this has been done already in physics a while back, but in psychology, one of the champions of this approach has been Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate. And we kind of followed his footsteps also in the field of consciousness. I should say this has all, for me at least, started as an email I received from David Potgieter from the World Charity, Templeton World Charity Foundation. And he told me about this workshop that they're planning where they want to develop experiments for 3 theories of consciousness. And he did that together with Christoph Koch, who has been my mentor during my postdoc. So when I got this email, I was very excited, of course, to join. I was a relatively young PI at the time, opened my lab a few years earlier than that. And when I got the list of invitees, I understood that this is a completely different story than what I had in mind. We all met at the Allen Institute. This was March 2018. And in this meeting were Stanislas Dehaene from GNW and Giulio Tononi from IIT, Hakuan Lau from Higher Order Thought was also there in that meeting, although at some point he decided to leave our project and we were left with GNW and IIT only. And you can see there people like David Chalmers, philosophers, and Francis Fallon, and other researchers, Lucia Meloni and Michael Pitts that I mentioned before, Hal Blumenfeld and others. And what we did there in these 2 days have been, I must say, for me, some of the 2 most wonderful days of my life. I always dare to say that because, you know, I have kids and other happy things happen to me, but these were so stimulating, the discussions there. We were basically sitting around this table with a whiteboard, no presentations. People just spoke and we tried to come up with predictions that would push the theories outside their comfort zone. And gradually but surely, there were clear differences that we could come up with between the theories and some predictions for the different activities that we might find. And these initial ideas turned into experiments. So that was the conception in March 2018. And then it took us almost a year to develop the experiments that would actually be able to test these predictions. We came up with 2 experiments. We weren't able to converge on 1 experiment, but we had 2 experiments that complemented each other, and I will present them to you surely enough. Soon enough. And we even had the adversaries sign when we pre-registered these experiments and the predictions, and also got the grant to run this experiment. We even had the adversaries sign a letter saying that they approved the experimental design, that for it to be suitable for testing specific prediction for their theory, and that the predictions that we derived in the process were indeed good enough predictions of the theories. And that was actually David's idea at the time, and I thought, you know, why do we need that? But in retrospect, I think that's a very important move. So what we did when we had the pre-registration ready was to already publish the pre-registration itself, so publish the predictions. And I want to say that this entire process whereby we went back and forth between the adversaries and we tried to come up with an experiment that would test their theory, and one gave one prediction and we went to the other and said, no, but that's not clear enough. And David Chalmers saying to us, no, this experimental condition is not decisive enough between the theories. That on its own, I think, has been a very fruitful process. And indeed, we were able to extract predictions from the theories that did not even exist before. because the theories did not answer some of the questions that we posed to them in this process. We were also able to get specific regions of interest, a list of areas. Before this project, the discussion was basically, is it in the front of the brain or the back of the brain? The front was kind of a fuzzy definition, and the same went for the back. But now in this process, we got a list of clear areas that people that the theories have given us. So even before we even run the experiments, we hope that the conceptual process that we went through will be beneficial for the community at large. And indeed, already, you know, there have been some experiments that have been reanalyzed with these predictions in mind, showing results that are very similar to ours, and we're very happy about that. I will mention that also later on. And then in May 2022, we started the data collection. No, we finished the data collection in May 2022. We collected it for 2 years, starting 2020. Also, all of you probably remember what happened in 2020. So that was a challenge on its own right with COVID. But in this experiment, we collected data from fMRI, MEG, and EEG concurrently, and ECOG or IEEG. Together, we have 250 participants, each one of them conducting the 2 experiments besides the IEEG patients who only did the first one. So this generated also a relatively unique data set of about 500 data sets together from the 3 different modalities with the same experiment. So that also we think could be a good resource for the community to ask additional questions once we share that data with the community, which we of course will do. Then what we did was, with the analysis teams, we analyzed only 1/3 of the data to give the theories the best chance to prove their predictions right. So we tried it in different ways. If they said that there should be decoding, and for example, then we tried different decoding schemes until we were all happy with the protocol that we had. And then we amended the pre-registration again with the final and outmost detail, like all the details of the analysis. And then tested the generalizability of the findings on the remaining 2/3 of the data. And the results that I will present to you today are already of the replication stage. Now, I should say the paper is now under review. So what I'm going to present to you is unreviewed data, unreviewed results. You could be the judge of that. I also want to say that this is only the middle of the process, because these results are only for the first experiment out of 2. The second experiment is now being analyzed. The data from the second experiment is now being analyzed by our teams. And so the final kind of outcome of this endeavor has yet to be established. Okay, so, and of course, then we will also need to integrate between them. So before I continue, I just want to say that this is the work of many. And I want to highlight the people who have been doing the work itself for over 5 years now, especially the students and the postdocs, Oscar, Ursula, Simon, Ronnie, Aya, Alex, Ling, Jamil, Katerina, and David. And recently we also had Tzvi Roth join us, and Matthias Ackermann. And these people are basically, they're the ones who did, you know, imagine, and sorry, Chaba Kozma, who I forgot to mention, they have been running the experiment, collecting the data, analyzing it. And it's not easy to do in such a big group. So it's very different than running your own experiment. So I really want to highlight their devotion. Of course, also the PIs that have been involved, and our project manager, Tanya Brown. And I mentioned before, Lucia Meloni and Michael Pitts. So we have been co-directing this project together. And I just want to say that it's been a huge privilege and honor to learn from these 2 outstanding researchers and work with them together on this. We should also acknowledge the integrity and the braveness of both Tononi and Dehan, who have been willing to put their theories on the line and test them in such a public test. It's not an easy thing to do, and I just want to acknowledge that as well. And here's Tanya Brown, our project manager, without whom we couldn't have done any of this. It's also a global project with respect to the labs. So we have labs all over the world. And if you take into account the origin of the people in this project, then we have basically a representative from all over the place, representatives. And so we are very fortunate to be diverse in that respect as well. And look at data that comes from different areas in the world. Okay, so what do we have? Let's go to the science. So the first experiment is basically an experiment that I will go into the details very soon, but the idea there is that we present one stimulus at a time very clearly on the screen. There is no degradation of the stimulus, so it's presented at full contrast for either half a second, a full second, or a second and a half. The stimuli could either be targets or non-targets, so we manipulate the relevance of the stimuli to the task. And we ask two questions. One is, what mechanisms underlie the multifaceted aspects of conscious experience? So we want to know which brain areas represent or have information about all aspects of conscious experience. And I'll explain that soon enough. And how is a conscious percept maintained over time? So these are the questions that are asked in the first experiment. The second experiment is a video game where we basically, I'll show you, we contrast between seen and unseen stimuli. So just to give you an impression of how this looks like, I think I should probably share this now with a video. So what you see here is the experiment, the video game. And basically, you are this, make that softer. So you are this, moving circle, and you're collecting circles in the same color and ignoring circles in the different color. And if you now look, I don't know if you managed to see, let me take that back. Take a look at this area here. There was a face that was presented. You can see it if I go back in time. You can see it here, up. Here, you see that there was a face that was presented. And every once in a while, we stop the video game, basically. And we ask you, did you see something in that location? You can see that the small arrow there points at that location. And what happens is that the game is so demanding, and its difficulty adapts to the way you play the game, so that we try to get participants into this sweet spot where they stay engaged and they would miss half the stimuli and consciously perceive the other half, and then we can compare the activations between seen and unseen. So this is the experiment that we are working on now, but what I will present to you now are the results of the first experiment. And the idea here is we use the Mona Lisa as a metaphor. So when you look at the Mona Lisa, you see many things. You see that it's a woman. You see that her face is directed to the side. You see the colors. You see it for a certain amount of time. And we wanted to capture all these aspects of conscious experience in one experiment. So what we did in this experiment, and I should say the design was inspired by Faruqi and Manley, who presented stimuli that were whose relevance was manipulated by the task, and by the work from Leonda Wells Lab, my former supervisor, the work of Ed and Gerber and others. What they did there was to present stimuli in isolation, much like our experiment, but for different durations. And I mentioned before that there were researchers who took our predictions and then reanalyzed their data in light of these predictions. And Leon was one of them, and in the work, a beautiful work by Gal Vishne. So we were very happy to see how our results actually replicate results from other studies as well. So what did we do here? We had 4 categories of stimuli: faces, objects, letters, and false fonts, which are basically meaningless symbols. And we chose these categories so that we'll have 2 categories that are related or similar to one another, like the objects and the faces, and the letters and the false fonts, but have these 2 categories differ. So the faces and objects are very different from the letters and the false fonts, and vice versa. Why did we do that? In order to be able to have participants differentiate between these two classes very easily. So we basically manipulated the category of the stimuli. You can see that we manipulated the orientation. So the stimuli were either presented frontally or to the right or to the left. We manipulated the identity. So for each category, we had 10 different identities. We manipulated the duration of the stimuli. So as I said, they could have been presented in one of 3 possible durations, long durations. And we manipulated task relevance. How was this done? So at the beginning of each trial, we presented 2 stimuli that served as targets. In this example, the letter R and the false font that looked like an upside down 4. And participants had to press a button whenever they saw one of these. And then we just presented a stream of stimuli for different durations, very visible, very clearly presented on the screen, and participants did their task. So the result is that you now have, here is the target R. So you now have stimuli that are targets. You have other stimuli that are non-targets, like this false font. So it's relevant to the task because it's in the same category as the target, but it's not the target. And this is different from, let's say, a face. When a face is presented, we consider it task irrelevant because or an object, because it doesn't belong to one of the 2 categories from which the targets were selected. So basically in the design, we now have, let me go back for a second. We now have targets here marked in red. We have task relevant non-targets, which are basically other items from the same categories from which the targets are drawn. And we have task irrelevant stimuli that are stimuli taken from the 2 other categories. And of course, in different trials, we have different targets. So then the same stimuli are sometimes task relevant and sometimes task irrelevant. Our rationale here, this is not a common experiment in consciousness studies because there is no contrast between seen and unseen. This we will have in experiment 2, as I said. But what we wanted to get at are these clear cases when no one can deny that the stimulus is perceived. So we can push the theories to their limit and ask, in this scenario where we give you the best chance for your predictions to come through, do we find evidence for the patterns that you predict? So what did the theories predict? They predicted, we had 3 main predictions. One relates to decoding of information, and the theories basically had predictions about which areas should show information about the content of perception, irrespective of what that content is. We had a prediction about the maintenance of a percept, so what should be the temporal pattern of activation that maintains a percept over time. And we had activations about synchronization patterns, so which areas are supposed to be synchronized while you are perceiving a certain stimulus. We also had an additional analysis, which I won't go into here, which tried to identify the areas that are kind of the candidates for the neural correlates of consciousness, but we cannot say anything about these correlates because we don't have the contrast with the unseen condition. So it's basically a very wide, casting a very, very wide net. So the first prediction. The first prediction says that we should find information in the brain about both the category of the stimuli and their orientation. According to GNW, we should find this information in posterior areas, of course, but also in prefrontal areas. And for IIT, there should be maximal decodability of content in posterior areas. Now, I should say, and it's important, that this prediction by IIT was not a core prediction. We didn't define it as a critical test for the theory. Why? Because this is a prediction that many theories actually share. So it's not a unique prediction for IIT. I will show you some unique predictions of the theory later on. About the maintenance of a percept. So here there were 2 things that we predicted. the theories predicted. So first about patterns of activation. GNW, if you remember, claims that there should be an ignition signal at the beginning of the stimulus and another ignition signal at the end of the stimulus in prefrontal areas. In between, the workspace is silent, basically. So we were looking for this pattern of a first peak at the beginning and another peak at the end. That was the prediction by GNW, and it was a critical prediction. And for IIT, the prediction was that there should be a sustained content-specific activity throughout the duration of the stimulus. So that was the activation hypothesis. For the RSA, the representational similarity analysis, we had an additional core prediction for GNW, which wasn't a core prediction, for IIT, which wasn't a core prediction for GNW, claiming that we should find this sustained representation throughout the entire activity, the entire duration of the stimulus, while for GNW, we predicted, or they predicted, an onset again and an offset pattern. Third prediction, and that will be the last one that we will discuss here, is the synchronization patterns. So for GNW, there should be synchronization, content-specific synchronization between the visual areas that are involved in the specific content. So for example, FFA for faces and LOC for objects, and the prefrontal cortex, because the information is being amplified by the global workspace. We should find these synchronization patterns. For IIT, on the other hand, the synchronization should be found between these high-level visual areas, FFA and LOC, but with posterior areas in the visual system, specifically V1 and V2. And that is not a trivial prediction by the theory, because none of the theories that I'm familiar with actually predict that there should be an ongoing, sustained synchronization between V1 and V2 and high-level visual areas like FFA and LOC. So these are the three predictions. And based on these predictions, we created this table, which basically summarizes what each theory predicts. And what do we find then? And importantly, we think that our findings are meaningful because we are now looking at convergence over different tests, over different techniques, fMRI, MEG, IEEG, over different samples, because each technique was tested in 2 different labs. So we are not limited to one sample, and over populations in that respect. And we also, I just remind you that we have this replication phase. So we are now testing the generalizability in a within replication design also within our project. So what did we find? So let's start with the first prediction, decoding of information. So decoding of category, faces versus objects, letters versus false fonts. This is the work by Aya Khalaf. This is fMRI. We find information both in posterior areas and in frontal areas. So here, both predictions actually are borne out by the data. But when it comes, when we look at MEG and IEEG, we find in frontal areas as well, we find significant decoding. So we have converging evidence from all 3 techniques for decoding of category from frontal areas. So that's good news for GNW and IIT. What about decoding of orientation? And this is, I forgot to say, this is the work of Ling Lu and Simon Henin. Now, bear in mind that the orientation test is even more strict in a way, because orientation has been completely task irrelevant. It's completely orthogonal to the task participants are performing. And here we find information in posterior areas, but not in frontal areas. So this doesn't align with GNW's prediction. We did find some decoding. You see this small blip in the MEG data. So that's the lower graph on the right, where we found some significant decoding in the front. But the problem was that we weren't able to exclude leakage. So the MEG signal is not very well localized in space. It's highly localized in time. So we couldn't rule out that this activation, this decoding that is slightly higher than chance, that it actually stems from posterior areas and the signal leaking into frontal one. So we ended up not concluding that we find support for GNW for this specific prediction. Moving on to timing. So do we find the sustained activation for IIT? Yes, we do, both for the IEEG data. So what you see here, this is the work by Alex Lopavro, and what you can see here are specific electrodes from IEEG that showed this sustained activation, both irrespective of category, which is what you see on the left, and category selective electrodes. This specific electrode is specific for faces, is selective for faces. And you can see that you have a very clear tracking of the duration in line with IIT predictions. And you also find it in the MEG signal as shown by Oscar Ferrante's data. What about the front? So here you see what we found was clear support for the onset prediction. So you find a clear onset response, but unfortunately, we were unable to substantiate the claim of the offset response. So you can see here, there was only one electrode that was indeed in the front and showed the predicted offset response. You can see it also in the raster plot on the right. The problem is that these offset responses were earlier than the time window predicted by IIT, by GNW, excuse me. We also find some support in the MEG data, but not in frontal areas. So at the end of the day, we couldn't find support for the offset aspect of the temporal prediction by GNW. So this is a challenge to the theory. Oh, sorry about that. Also, when we look at the RSA, so remind you sorry, I don't know why this is. So I remind you that that IIT predicted sustained RSA, and we do find sustained RSA for category and for identity, but critically not for orientation. So this is a challenge to the theory, because we would have expected to find sustained representational similarity also for orientation. For GNW, unfortunately, we don't find the predicted 4 squares pattern that we were expecting to find. So we do find RSA in the front. For category, we didn't find anything for orientation, and surely we didn't find this pattern that was predicted by the theory. Okay, last prediction, synchrony. So here it was an interesting case, because the analysis that we pre-registered did not yield support for neither theories. And so at this point, we actually consulted with experts, and they suggested another analysis for synchrony. And here we did find support for GNW and not for IIT. So this prediction by IIT actually was not borne out by the data. They explained that the reason might be that we had too few electrodes. We had only 12 electrodes, but still, this is what the data shows. Also, when you look at the fMRI connectivity patterns, we do find connectivity with frontal areas in line with GNW. So if I try to kind of wrap up where things stand, the first experiment yielded challenges to both theories. So none of them was able to confirm all its predictions. And we think that this might merit some thinking from the theory side to try and explain why this has not happened. But we also want to emphasize that it is only one part of the picture. And the full picture, we hope, would be established when we get the results also from experiment 2. So before I try to explain why this is important in the final minutes that I will have left, I also want to pause and I get some questions from you, because I imagine that you might have some questions. Yeah, so questions about this part of the talk?
No. I see Valjean has her hand up.
Yes, sorry, my question actually goes back to the first part. And the number of papers that you had, what criteria did you have for accepting or not accepting papers?
Yeah.
There was
So-
something like 8,000 and you
Yeah,
came
yeah.
down.
So what we did was two things. We chose for each theory 3 key papers, and we examined every paper that quoted these 3 papers by theory. And we also defined a search parameter where every paper, every neuroscientific paper that mentioned one of the 4 theories in either the abstract, the title, or the keywords was included as well.
Yeah. And the other question was, does IQ or cognitive capacity have any incidence in these experiments?
No, not
No.
that. So this was not measured. And also when we talk about tests for consciousness, which will be the last part of my talk, we intentionally differentiate between intelligence and consciousness because we think that these are 2 separate phenomena.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Valjean. Paul, would you like to come in?
Okay, the question I have is about cognitive processes, but before I do that, I really feel I need to congratulate you. You, first of all, such a wonderful presentation on such complex issues. And then you declared that the advance has to come from large cooperation and discussion, and you put it into practice. And that's amazing. I think that's going to be true for many complex issues in psychology, psychiatry. Can be only resolved, I think, in international collaboration. The question I had was, it seems to me that your research really is focusing primarily on cognitive processes and their unfolding and how that involves different parts of the brain. I wonder whether your call for cooperation will not have to involve some other areas that relate to consciousness and that these processes don't seem to touch. For example, how the self-awareness takes place. How do experiences are set up in a linear time and space? The problem since Kant that exists. Yeah. The issues of non-ordinary states of consciousness. I think these are other areas that I think some cooperation will be probably.
I very much agree. I very much agree. And there are studies, from Olaf Blanke, for example, and Roy Salomon and Nathan Fevre about bodily awareness and self-awareness that are very relevant. There are also many interactions with philosophers about questions of the type that you presented. And I couldn't agree more. I think that consciousness is probably one of the most interdisciplinary questions that require a wide look. So I very much agree with what you said.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul, for coming in. Justin, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Liad, for a great talk. It's very interesting to see, kind of the inner workings of how the project got started and where it's going now. My question is about formalization of these theories. I'm doing some independent theoretical work on IIT, and it's the most mathematically formalized of the theories that you're testing, but even IIT, you can't actually do the calculations for, what is the phi level of any particular brain region. And so I'm curious, has the process of adversarial collaboration, has that led to greater formalization of both IIT and Global Workspace?
Yeah, not in the sense that you're talking about. So I don't think that our project helped them make progress with quantifying phi, for example. But I do think that it has contributed to a specification, which is a type of formalization of some of the hypotheses. So, for example, for GNW, we didn't have any prediction about the maintenance of a percept over time before this project. So now we have that. Again, I mentioned the regions of interest that were not specified. For IIT, the synchronization prediction to me was new. Maybe it was said before. So I think it did push the theories to provide more concrete and well-defined predictions.
Right. Makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you.
Maybe one last question, so then I would have a few more minutes for the very last part.
Of course, Raymond.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. And this is probably a tangential question because I'm not a scientist, but has neuroscience found any experiences that simultaneously light up all the regions of the brain? In other words, that would produce, I don't know, a whole brain synchronization. Is there any such thing?
I think the closest thing to that is probably epilepsy attacks. So in seizures, you have synchronization between, I don't know if all areas, but many areas in the brain, and that synchronization and overactivation is what causes the seizures. But other than that, I'm not aware of anything of the sort that you are asking. But it's a very interesting question, for sure.
Thank you.
Sure. So just for the very few moments I have left, I kind of wanted to say that, you know, for me, this question of consciousness has always been the most intriguing, fascinating, exciting question there is. But in recent years, I also understood that it's more than a theoretical puzzle, and it has real life meaning. Other people understood it way before me, but to me, for some reason, it took some time. So I want to tell you a little bit about some conceptual work that we've been engaged in as part of the CIFAR Brain, Mind, and Consciousness program. This was led by Tim Bain, whom I mentioned before. And this is a paper that is about to come out on TICS, where we discuss tests for consciousness. And there was a question before about AI. AI now has been claimed by some to be conscious. And I think that one of the most important contributions our field could give to society at large is developing tests for consciousness. And what we try to do in this specific paper is to describe some of the existing tests and ask how they can be verified. And although there we don't take a theoretical approach, in other works that I've done, including with Mirto Milopoulos and Nicolo Negro, who we mentioned before, and Aaron Scherger, we actually try to take each one of these theories, and here we added another one, the attentional schema theory, was very interesting, and try to ask, what can we take from these theories of consciousness? How can we use them in order to inform questions of life and death and questions of consciousness in different systems and in different mechanisms? And I kind of just want to highlight these works for you in case you might find them interesting. Another one that is currently just a preprint is a joint work of philosophers and computer scientists and neuroscientists all working on consciousness, led by Patrick Batlin and Robert Long. And there, what we try to do in that group is actually to derive from each one of the theories the theories that are that assume a functional role for consciousness, the critical functions that the theories ascribe to conscious processing, and use those as markers that we can then apply on AI system, on artificial intelligence, and ask whether they show evidence for holding that function or not. And if they do, here we have differences of opinion in the group. Some people in the group actually think that if we find an AI system that shows all the markers, all the functions that in humans coincide with conscious processing, then it's not only a matter of function, but specifically here we talk about computational functionalism. So it's not only that they show the function, but they also do it in the same computational way that we do it. Then there will be a good enough reason to argue that these systems are conscious. I take a more agnostic approach. I don't know if computational functionalism is true, but I do think that when it comes to AI, it is probably the most promising approach we have in our toolbox. So if I find an AI that is able to fulfill all these conditions, then I would say that the chances of this system of being conscious are higher than those of a system that don't fulfill all these markers. So I think it gives us a good way to at least approach the question of consciousness in AI, which is, as you probably know, a very complicated question. So to sum up, I just want to thank you for listening and for your excellent questions. I also want to highlight the Cogitate project. This is a photo from the kickoff meeting of that project, although since then we have changed and more people have been added and so on, but that's from the original event where everything started. My lab in the center in Tel Aviv University, I'm very fortunate to work with outstanding students. And this is the Brain, Mind, and Consciousness program where we started thinking about test for consciousness. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take more questions if you have any. And I hope that I've persuaded you that these questions are not only theoretical, but they also have practical implications, which make them even more important than I already thought they are. So thank you very much. And again, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Liad, for this awesome talk. Like, it was super fascinating, and also within 2 hours you went into the complexity of 4 different theories and all the empirical evidence. So thank you very much for that. And we can take maybe 1 or 2 questions if there is a time. So Steve, if you
Okay.
just 1 second.
You may have missed,
Okay.
Yeah.
I may have missed part of your talk when my connection was broken. You may have answered this question, but the question is, Ledoux and Lau have this self-monitoring model. And I was interested to find out why neither of them, well, Lau, I guess, dropped out at some point. Is it because they didn't think their model was amenable to this kind of measurement, or what was the reason?
So we just weren't able to reach an agreement about, so Hakwan did not agree that our experiment is good enough to test his theory. And we weren't able to reach an agreement about, so many of the predictions so for example, the duration prediction, how is a percept maintained over time? This is not something that the theory had answers to. So it was a combination of, I guess, a theoretical disagreement with the other theories and experimental disagreement about the specific design that we chose and its suitability to test his theory.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for a great talk.
Thank you so much.
And now, Niels, if okay.
Thank you. You mentioned AI.
Yes.
And this is where my ears start going up like this. And because I did, for many years, I have worked with transportation modeling, pedestrian movement, like nothing more complex than that. And I've actually now accepted for myself that what I have is actually a super intelligence. You could call it transportation mind or brain, because the way the simulation is done is have those ingredients where you can see the simulator or the program is the mind, and each individual has got their own mind and their own consciousness, we call it that, and so in a sense, I've got all these things together, and what it amounts to is really like a wholeness thing, wholeness and implicate order. It turns out that the implicate order in it, not quite like Bohm didn't quite get far enough, is actually the state in the now. And you'll know what the cost would be for you to take one or the other, because this mind creates what you could call the spirit, and the spirit is the thing that will direct everyone according to their want of where they want to go, or also if they don't want to play the game with collaborating with the simulator, then there comes some variance in, because they can't actually make the right decision. So you can see it's a mix of, and the interesting thing with that is that in the chaotic thing, that people will just go in circles if they don't know where to go. We've all experienced this thing that if you are not quite know where to go, oh, I'm back, I've just been here. So that kind of thing. So I'm encouraged by that. I need to do, I've done the work and want to write a book about it, because it relates to the spiritual, is the right hemisphere, if you like. The Holy Spirit, as it's also called. And
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for your talk. I've learned a lot. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Niels. Do we have the time for one last question, or we are?
I can stay for one question, but
Well, okay, thank you very much. So June.
Yeah, I want to echo everybody else's deep and profound gratitude for this extraordinary clarity of very complex and interwoven. So my question sort of relates to what Niels was saying. In the higher order theories, which I realize it's probably at the edge of what you've amassed in terms of data, how do the states of consciousness that are in the microtubules, if that's sort of a foundational place. So if AI is ultimately made of silica, which is an element, and then the synaptic firing electric signals of whatever is electromagnetic in sand, i.e. silica, as something that is also within our own, I don't know how to say it. I don't have the language, but what study in that theoretical higher order theoretical model could address the meta physics, right? To include what some at the Science of Consciousness would say is within the spiritual or Vedic, so the meta physics. In other words, if silica is non-local, then isn't it also possible that there's a non-locality, going back to this subtle energy that the Taoists have known about in things like Qigong or Tai Chi or something like this, that could be the patterning or the what I call, and I'm putting it in this paper that's supposed to come out soon, as the forms, which people say is the soul of the matter energy. So if we go from a materialist energy foundation, and we include the wholeness or the implicate causal capacities, and we have a implicate causal of forms as inseparable from material energies, what form, as I'm going back to I'm trained as an architect and
we're a bit short on time. If you can sort of synthesize it in a circumscribed question, would be helpful. If you,
I know, it's almost impossible in language. What shape is a meta shape that in this theory, in this higher order theory, that is universal, so to speak, in all material, all energies? And I think unless we can imagine that, which artists, musicians can, then we're not going to see an invisible hidden variable, so to speak, or a hidden in plain sight consciousness, and you'll never find it. And you'll keep going around this methods, but
Yeah.
you'll never find it. But it's already there. If you look in what Niels is saying, it's already there
I'm
for
I'm
6,000
stopping
years.
you. I'm stopping you just because my kids are waiting for dinner, so I want to.
I know. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
No. So just to say, and also because I simply don't have an answer. So unfortunately, I don't know the answer to your question, and so I cannot give you a good enough answer for that. But I definitely think it's an interesting question, and I think these connections that you're suggesting between the way we study this question and the way people have done that in different traditions are very interesting. I had some chance to conduct dialogues on that, probably not enough. So unfortunately, I don't know enough about it to give you an answer. Thank you, though.
So let's not took more time away from Professor Mudrik. Thank you for everything, and we will see you next week where our series continues. So thank you everybody for joining us, and have a good night.
Bye.